They said when judgment comes to a man, it rides loud with guns and dust, but that morning it came quiet enough to hear the wind move through dry grass. And by the time Ethan Cole opened his door, the valley was already filled with riders he hadn't heard approach. Not one hoof out of place, not one voice raised, just a wide circle of Apache warriors holding the horizon like they'd been there all night waiting for the sun to show him what was coming. He stood still on the wooden boards of his porch, boots forgotten somewhere inside the house, the early air cold against his skin, and in his hand something small, something broken, a necklace of turquoise beads split clean through the cord, frayed where it had been pulled too hard. He looked at it once like a man trying to remember a dream that didn't want to stay whole. And he lifted his eyes and saw them clearer. Now men tall in their saddles, faces unreadable, painted not for war, but for something older, something quieter, the kind of silence that doesn't need to threaten because it already knows how this ends. Behind him, the cabin door creaked once in the breeze and stopped like even the wood understood this wasn't a morning for noise. Ethan stepped down one plank at a time, the boards answering with soft, tired sounds under his weight. 10 feet from the porch, he stopped, not close enough to challenge, not far enough to run, because a man like him didn't run, not from this, not from what he already knew had found him the night before. Came back in pieces, not as a story, but as sensations. The rush of water louder than thunder, the cold grabbing at his legs, the shape of a woman slipping under the surface, her hand reaching not for him, but for something she was losing. He had gone in without thinking, because thinking takes time, and time is what the river takes first. He remembered the feel of her arm in his grip, strong, then weaker, the current pulling at her clothes, dragging her down, and the only way to keep hold was to grab higher, tighter, until the cord around her neck snapped in his hand, and the beads scattered into the dark water like something sacred breaking open between two worlds. He got her out, that much he knew, laid her on the bank, breathing alive. But when she looked at him, it wasn't relief in her eyes. It was something else, something that made him step back before she even moved. She had taken what was left of the necklace from his hand, then not with anger, not with fear, just with a kind of quiet that felt heavier than either, and she had gone without a word, disappearing into trees that knew her name. Now the riders sat waiting, and the town far off behind the ridge had begun to stir, men watching from a distance, not close enough to be seen, but close enough to carry stories. By noon, Ethan could feel that part already, the way truth bends when it travels through too many mouths. He didn't turn to look at them, didn't offer a word to the circle in front of him either. He just opened his hand and let the broken necklace hang where they could see it, the turquoise catching the first full light of morning. And for a long moment nothing moved, not the riders, not the horses, not even the wind. And then from the center of that silence, she stepped forward, the same woman from the river, walking her horse slow, until she was the only one between Ethan and everything that could have followed. Her eyes went to the necklace first, then to his face, and whatever she saw there made her stop, just out of reach, like the space between them mattered more than the distance behind her. Ethan didn't speak, didn't lower his hand, didn't do anything a man might do to save himself, because out here saving yourself sometimes meant saying the wrong thing. And he had already taken something from her once. He wasn't about to take her choice too. And the valley held its breath, waiting to see what kind of man he had decided to be. When no one was there to tell him what was right, no one spoke. And that was the first thing that felt wrong, because men who come to take something always make noise about it. They shout, they threaten, they let the world know what they believe is theirs. But these men sat quiet as stone, their horses steady beneath them, like they had been trained not just to ride, but to wait, and the waiting stretched long enough that even the sun seemed unsure how fast to rise over the ridge. Ethan kept his hand open, the broken necklace resting across his palm, the turquoise catching light in small flashes that felt louder than anything else in the valley. The woman stepped closer, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, the way a person walks when they already know how a moment ends, but have not decided yet how it will be remembered. She stopped 5 feet from him, close enough that he could see the faint line where the cord had once rested against her skin, close enough to see that her eyes were not angry. They were measuring him like he was something unfinished, something still deciding what it was meant to be. Behind her, one of the older men shifted in his saddle, the movement small but deliberate, and Ethan felt it like a change in weather, not a threat, just a reminder that this was not only between him and her. It never had been. The land held more witnesses than people ever counted. The river, the trees, the silence itself, all of it carried memory. And this morning memory had come to stand in a circle around him. The woman reached out slowly, not toward his face, not toward his chest, but toward his hand, and for a moment, it seemed like she might take the necklace, and in whatever this was before it began, but her fingers stopped just short, hovering there like she was testing the space between them. Then she looked up at him again and spoke, her voice low but clear enough that every rider heard it, and even the men watching from the distant ridge would later swear they felt the words though they could not understand them. "You held on," she said in careful English, the accent soft but steady. "You did not let go." Ethan did not answer, not because he could not, but because he knew some things lost their truth the moment you tried to explain them. She studied his silence the way a person studies a map that does not show the road they expected. Then her gaze dropped back to the necklace, and this time she did take it, her fingers closing over the broken cord with a gentleness that carried more weight than any anger could have. She turned it once in her hand, feeling where it had snapped, where the fibers had given way, and for a second something like pain crossed her face, not for herself, not even for what was lost, but for the choice that had been made in that moment by a man who did not know what it would cost him. She lifted the necklace so the riders behind her could see it, and a quiet ripple moved through them, not surprise, not confusion. Something closer to recognition, like a story they had heard before, but never witnessed with their own eyes. Ethan watched them, not searching for approval, not bracing for judgment, just watching the way a man watches a storm when he has already decided not to run. Then the woman did something that shifted the air entirely. She stepped back one pace, turned slightly, so she stood between him and the circle, and spoke again, this time not in English, the words moving through the riders like wind through tall grass, each man listening not with his ears alone, but with something older, something tied to who they were long before this valley had fences. When she finished, she looked at Ethan once more, and there was a question there now, not spoken, but waiting, the kind of question that cannot be asked out loud, because it only has meaning if the answer comes without being demanded. Ethan felt it settle on him, heavier than the morning light, heavier than the eyes of every man in that circle, and slowly he closed his hand around nothing where the necklace had been and let it fall to his side, like he had already given everything he was going to give, and whatever came next would not change that. The silence returned deeper than before, but it was no longer empty. It was full of something building, something deciding, and somewhere far off a horse shifted, and the sound carried just enough to remind everyone listening that this moment was not over. It had only just begun. The old man in the center of the riders moved, then not forward, not back, just enough for the others to notice, and when he lifted his chin, the entire circle seemed to settle into something firmer, like a line had been drawn that no one else could see, but everyone understood. He did not look at Ethan first, he looked at the woman, and she met his gaze without lowering hers. And in that exchange something passed between them, not words, not permission, something closer to memory, the kind that belongs to a people, not a person alone. She stepped aside, half a pace, not retreating, not yielding, just opening the space, as if to say the moment no longer belonged only to her, and the old man urged his horse one step forward, the animal moving slow, deliberate hooves pressing into the dust like each inch mattered more than distance. Ethan felt the weight of it, without shifting his stance, his hand still empty at his side, the shape of the necklace lingering there like something that had marked him even after it was gone. The old man studied him in silence long enough that the watching men on the ridge began to shift uneasy, not because they understood what was happening, but because they did not, and fear often grows best in that kind of space where meaning hides just out of reach. Then the old man spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying across the still air in words Ethan could not follow, yet somehow felt settle into his chest all the same. It was not anger, it was not accusation, it was something measured, something that asked without begging and judged without raising itself above what it judged. The woman answered him, her voice softer now, but certain, and when she spoke the old man's eyes returned to Ethan, not sharp, not cold, just searching, as if looking for the place where a man's truth either holds or breaks under its own weight. Ethan did not try to guess the words, did not look to the town or the sky for help, because he knew this was not a moment that could be borrowed from anything outside it. It had to be stood in fully, or not at all. The old man nodded once, slow enough to be final, then he reached down to the saddle and lifted something small wrapped in worn leather. He held it there, not offering it, yet just letting it be seen. And the riders shifted again, not in tension, but in recognition, like they all knew what rested in his hand, even if Ethan did not. The woman glanced at it briefly, then back to Ethan, and for the first time since she had stepped into the circle, something in her expression changed, not softer, not harder, just clearer, like whatever question had been waiting before had now found the shape of its answer. The old man spoke again this time, in English, each word careful, placed like stones in a path you either walk or turn away from. You took what was not yours, he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. The valley seemed to hold that sentence longer than it should have, as if even the air wanted to understand how it would be answered. Ethan did not flinch, did not reach for an explanation that might soften it, because he knew what the man meant, and he knew it was true. He had taken something not out of want, not out of disrespect, but because there had been no other way, and sometimes the reason does not change the weight of the act. He nodded once, not in agreement with guilt, but in acceptance of the truth that stood between them. I did, he said, his voice quiet but steady, and that was all. No defense, no story, no reaching for sympathy, just the shape of what had happened laid bare in the simplest form. The old man watched him a moment longer, then lowered the leather bundle slightly, as if something unseen had shifted, not in the world, but in the space between two men who did not share a language, but understood the cost of choices. The woman stepped forward again, not between them this time, but beside the old man, and when she spoke, her voice carried something new, not the weight of memory, not the edge of question, but the beginning of something that had not yet been named. He did not take it, she said. He gave something else. The words settled deeper than the first ones had, and the riders behind them grew still again, not waiting now, but listening in a way that felt different, like the story had turned, and they were all inside it, whether they wanted to be or not. Ethan did not move, did not ask what she meant, because part of him already knew this was not about the necklace anymore, not about the river or the night before. It was about what a man chooses when the choice takes something from him that he will not get back, and whether that choice can stand when others come to measure it in their own way. The old man's gaze shifted from the woman to Ethan, and for the first time, there was something in it that was not just judgment, it was consideration, slow, careful, as if he was weighing not the act, but the man who had made it. And somewhere beyond the circle, the wind found its way back across the valley, carrying dust and distance and the faint sense that whatever came next would not be decided by force, but by something far harder to face, because it asked nothing of a man except that he remain exactly who he had already chosen to be. The old man did not answer right away, and that silence carried more weight than anything he could have said, because it was not empty, it was working its way through every man in that circle like a slow current, testing what would hold and what would give. The leather bundle in his hand shifted slightly as his fingers tightened around it, not out of anger, not out of doubt, but as if the object itself demanded a decision that could not be rushed. The woman remained still beside him, her eyes no longer searching Ethan, but holding him there in place, like she was asking him to stay exactly as he was long enough for the truth to finish speaking. Without interruption, the wind moved again, low across the ground, lifting dust in thin lines that curled around boots and hooves, and for a moment it felt like the land itself was drawing breath before something important was spoken. The old man finally lowered his hand and unwrapped the leather slowly, each fold revealing a glimpse of what lay inside, until the final layer fell away and the object rested in his palm. A second necklace, older, heavier, the turquoise stones darker, worn smooth by time, and used, not broken, but marked in a way that spoke of years rather than moments. He held it out, not toward Ethan, not yet, just enough for all to see, and a quiet shift passed through the riders, not surprise, not curiosity, something deeper, something that belonged to memory and meaning. Ethan did not move, but his eyes followed the necklace, the shape of it, the weight it seemed to carry even from a distance, and something in his chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition, not of the object itself, but of what it represented. The old man spoke again, his voice steady. "This is not a thing you replace," he said, each word landing slow and certain. "It is a thing that carries a name, a place, a promise." The woman reached out and touched the edge of the necklace with her fingers, not taking it, just resting there like she was acknowledging what it was before turning her gaze back to Ethan. And in that look, there was no anger left, only something harder to face, respect mixed with the cost of it. "You broke one," the old man continued, and the words did not accuse, they measured. "You cannot make it whole again." Ethan let that settle. He did not argue, because he knew it was true, not just about the necklace, but about choices in general. Some things once broken remain that way no matter the reason. "And a man who understands that does not waste time pretending otherwise." "I know," he said quietly, and the sound of his voice did not rise or fall. It stayed where it was meant to be. The old man studied him a long moment, then shifted the necklace in his hand, and this time He did extend it, not offering it fully, but holding it in the space between them, where it could be taken or refused, and that space felt heavier than anything that had come before, because now the question had changed. It was no longer about what had happened, it was about what would be accepted. The woman spoke again, her voice softer now, but clear enough that every rider heard. He chose her life over the cord, she said, and the words carried no defense, no plea, only the truth laid plain. The old man did not look at her when she spoke. He kept his eyes on Ethan, and something in that gaze shifted, not softened, not hardened, just moved into a place where judgment gives way to decision. If you take this, he said slowly, you carry what it means, not just to us, but to yourself. The wind stilled again, like it was waiting for the answer. The town on the ridge had gone quiet. Even at that distance, the men watching could feel the weight of the moment, though they could not name it. Ethan looked at the necklace, then at the old man, then at the woman, and for the first time since the riders had come, there was something in his posture that changed, not fear, not relief, something like understanding settling into place. He did not reach for the necklace right away because he knew taking it would not fix what had been broken. It would not erase the moment by the river or the look in her eyes when the cord had snapped. It would only mean he accepted the weight of what that moment had become, and after a long breath, he stepped forward one pace, closing the distance just enough to stand inside that space where a man either takes what is offered or leaves it behind. And in that quiet, the entire valley seemed to lean in, waiting to see not what he would say, but what he would choose. His hand did not move right away, and that hesitation was not weakness, it was weight settling into place, the kind a man feels when he understands that what he does next will follow him longer than anything behind him. The necklace rested in the old man's palm, steady, unmoving, offered, but not given, and the space between them held something quiet and final. Ethan looked at it, not like a prize, not like a solution, but like a question that had already been answered somewhere deeper than words. He lifted his eyes to the old man first, then to the woman, and in that brief exchange something passed again, not permission, not approval, something closer to acknowledgement that whatever choice came next would not be undone by anyone watching. The wind shifted across the valley, carrying the faint smell of dry earth and distant water, and Ethan could almost hear the river again, not loud, not rushing, just present, a reminder of the moment that had led him here. He thought of the cord breaking in his hands, the feel of it giving way the instant where he had known there would be no clean ending to what he was doing, only a choice between what could be saved and what would be lost. He stepped forward the final inch and raised his hand slowly, not reaching out to take the necklace, but turning his palm upward like a man showing he carried nothing left to hide. The old man watched him closely, not urging, not pulling back, just waiting to see if the gesture meant what it appeared to mean. Ethan spoke, then his voice low, steady, the kind that does not try to convince anyone, but still finds its way into the air. I cannot take it, he said, and the words landed soft but clear, enough that every rider heard them. The town men on the ridge shifted again, confused by a moment they could not measure, because in their world a man either accepts what is offered or refuses out of pride, but this was neither. This was something else. The old man did not react right away, and the necklace remained where it was, suspended between them, like the morning itself had paused to listen. Ethan did not lower his hand. He kept it there, open, empty, as he continued, not to explain, but to complete the truth. I broke something that belonged to her, he said, and his gaze moved to the woman for a brief second, not asking forgiveness, not expecting it, just recognizing the fact. I cannot carry what replaces it. The wind moved again, light across the ground, and the silence that followed did not tighten, it deepened, like something settling into its proper place. The woman watched him closely, and there was no surprise in her eyes, only a quiet confirmation, as if she had been waiting not for his answer but for the way he would arrive at it. The old man lowered the necklace slowly, not in rejection, not in withdrawal, but in understanding. The motion deliberate, measured, like a door closing without force. He wrapped it again in the worn leather, each fold careful, until the object disappeared from sight, but not for meaning. Then he looked at Ethan once more, and this time there was no question left in his gaze, no test still waiting to be passed. There was only recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. You choose to keep what is yours to carry, he said, and it was not approval, and it was not judgment, it was simply naming the truth that had revealed itself. Ethan lowered his hand at last, not relieved, not burdened, just settled, like a man who has stopped trying to move a weight that belongs where it is. The woman stepped forward one pace, and this time she closed the distance, fully standing within reach. Her presence no longer a barrier, no longer a question, just there, like the moment had finally allowed itself to become something real. She looked at him not as a stranger, not as an enemy, but not as anything easily named either, and for a brief second the world beyond them, the riders, the town, the valley itself, seemed to fall away until there was only that space between two people who had shared a moment neither of them could return from. She lifted her hand, not to take anything, not to give anything, but to rest it lightly over the place where the necklace had once been broken, and her voice, when she spoke, carried no weight of the past, only the quiet shape of what came after. Then you understand, she said. And it was not a question, and somewhere behind her one of the riders shifted his horse, and another followed, and then another, until the circle that had held so still for so long began to change, not breaking, not dissolving, just easing like a line drawn in the dust that no longer needed to be held in place. The old man turned his horse, slightly, not away, not toward, just enough to show that whatever had come to pass here had reached its end, and the valley breathed again, slow and wide, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to remember how the first rider turned his horse not with command, but with understanding, and that single movement carried farther than any shouted order could have, because the others followed without hesitation, one by one, the wide circle loosening, not breaking, but releasing its hold on the morning like a hand opening after gripping something too long. Ethan did not move to watch them leave. He stood where he was, feeling the shift more than seeing it, the weight that had filled the valley, thinning, not gone, but changed into something that no longer pressed against his chest. The old man guided his horse past the woman and paused just long enough beside her to say something low that did not carry beyond the two of them. She nodded once and did not look away from Ethan as the old man moved on, the leather bundle resting once more at his side, untouched by the man who had been offered its meaning and had chosen instead to keep his own. The riders began to stretch out into a line heading back toward the far hills, their figures growing longer in the early light until they no longer felt like a wall, but like a memory already starting to fade. Yet none of them rushed and none of them looked back, because what had come to pass did not need to be checked twice. The woman remained where she was, even as the distance between her and the others grew 10 yards, then 20, until she stood alone in the open space that had once held all of them. Ethan finally let his breath settle fully into his chest, the kind that comes after a storm that never breaks. He glanced once toward the ridge where the town men had gathered earlier, and though they were still there, he could feel the distance between them now wider than before, not measured in yards, but in something harder to cross. They had come expecting one kind of ending, something they could name, something that would let them go back and say they understood what they had seen, but this was not that kind of story, and it left them quiet in a way that would stay with them longer than any clear answer ever could. The woman took a step closer, then another, until she stood just a few feet from Ethan again, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just with purpose. Her eyes held as steady, and there was no trace now of the fear he had seen by the river, only a calm that came from knowing something had been decided without needing to be forced. You stayed, she said, her voice soft but certain, and the words carried more than their meaning, because they were not about the moment in front of them. They reached back into the night before, into the water, into the choice he had made when no one was there to witness it. Ethan gave a small nod, not to confirm her words, but because there was nothing else that needed to be said about it. He could feel the quiet settling around them again, but this time it was different, not waiting, not heavy, just present, like the land had returned to itself after holding something larger than it for a brief time. She glanced once toward the departing riders, then back to him, and for the first time there was something like a question again, not the kind that demands an answer, but the kind that leaves room for one. If it is given, where will you go? She asked, and the words felt simple, but carried something deeper, because out here a question like that was never only about distance. Ethan looked past her toward the horizon, where the riders were now little more than shapes against the hills, then back to his cabin. Behind him the boards warned the door slightly open. The life he had known still waiting in the same place. It had always been. I am already there, he said quietly, and there was no pride in it, no claim, just the truth as he understood it. She studied him for a long second, as if measuring the shape of that answer against something she carried within herself. Then she gave a small nod, the kind that does not agree or disagree, but accepts what is offered for what it is. The wind moved again, lifting a strand of her hair across her face, and she brushed it aside with a motion so simple it felt like the first ordinary thing to happen since the riders had come. She turned then, not away from him, but toward the open valley, taking a few steps before pausing, And without looking back, she spoke once more. "The river does not forget," she said, and the words settled into the space between them, like something that would not fade with distance or time. Then she continued, walking her pace, unhurried, her path leading toward the place where the others had gone, until she too became part of that slow fading line. Ethan remained where he was for a while longer, the silence around him no longer asking anything of him. And when he finally turned back toward his cabin, he did not look at the ground or the sky. He looked straight ahead, carrying nothing in his hands, and everything that mattered exactly where it belonged. By the time Ethan stepped back inside his cabin, the light had already shifted from sharp morning gold to something softer, the kind that settles over the land when a day decides it will not rush itself. He closed the door, without sound, not out of caution, but out of habit, the same way a man does when he has lived long enough alone to understand that noise is something you choose, not something you make by accident. The room smelled faintly of wood and dust, and the lingering trace of coffee gone cold on the table where he had left it untouched hours earlier. He stood there for a moment, just inside the doorway, letting the quiet return to its usual place around him, but it did not feel the same. It was familiar, yes, but changed, like a river that has passed through a storm and carries something new beneath its surface. He walked to the table and rested his hand against the edge, not to steady himself, but to feel something solid, something that had not shifted under him the way the morning had. His fingers traced the worn grain of the wood, following lines that had been there long before he came and would remain long after he was gone. And for a brief moment, he thought of the necklace again, not the one offered, but the one broken, the feel of it snapping, the sound it made so small it could have been missed if the moment had not been so loud in every other way. He poured the cold coffee into the basin beside the window, watching it disappear into the dry soil outside, and the simple act grounded him in a way nothing else could, because some things you do not keep, some things you let go without marking them as lost. The wind moved against the side of the cabin, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves, long gone now, but still present enough to remind him that what had happened out there was not something he had imagined. He stepped back out onto the porch and looked across the valley. The riders were gone completely now. No trace left in the open space where they had stood, no dust, no movement, just the land as it had been before they arrived. And yet it was not the same, because he was not the same. The ridge where the town men had gathered was empty too, though he knew they had not gone far. Men like that do not leave a story unfinished. They carry it with them, shape it into something they can tell over a drink or a table until it fits into the world they understand. But this would not be that kind of story. It would sit with them longer than they wanted. It would return in quiet moments when they realized they did not know what they had seen, only that it had changed something in them. Without asking permission, Ethan rested his hands on the railing and let his gaze drift toward the river far off, just a thin line cutting through the land, but enough to hold memory. He could almost see it again, the way the water had moved, the way the current had taken hold, and how there had been no time to weigh right against wrong, only the simple truth that someone needed to be pulled free, and that doing so would leave something else behind. He had not thought about what that would mean. Then he had only acted, and now the meaning had found him anyway. The wind shifted again, bringing with it a cooler edge that hinted at evening, still hours away, but already on its way. Time did not stop for moments like this. It moved on, steady and sure, carrying everything with it, whether a man was ready or not. He turned from the railing and stepped down into the dust, the ground firm beneath his boots, the same as always, and yet each step felt more deliberate, as if he was aware now of something he had not been before. Not a burden, not a weight, just a clarity that came from having stood in a place where no one else could decide for him. He walked toward the edge of his property, where the land dipped slightly before rising again toward the hills, and there he stopped, looking out over everything that had remained and everything that had passed through. Without staying, he did not search for signs of the riders or the woman, because he knew there would be none, not the kind that could be followed or traced. What had been left behind was not meant to be seen. It was meant to be carried, and a man either does that quietly or not at all. The sun moved higher, casting shorter shadows across the ground, and Ethan stood there long enough for the moment to settle fully into him, not as something extraordinary, but as something real, something that would not need to be spoken to remain true. And when he finally turned back toward his cabin, he did so without looking over his shoulder, because there was nothing behind him that needed one last glance, only a day moving forward, and a man who had chosen to meet it exactly as he was. The day stretched out slow and unbroken, the way it always did out here, But there was a difference, now something beneath the surface that did not belong to routine or habit. Ethan moved through his work, without thinking, mending a loose board on the fence, checking the water trough, running his hand along the flank of his horse as it shifted quietly beside him, each task familiar, each motion practiced, but there was a stillness inside him that had not been there before, not emptiness, not distance, something clearer, like a man who has stopped asking questions that do not need answers. The sun climbed higher, pressing warmth into the land and pulling scent from the dry grass and dust, until the air itself felt thicker with it. Time passed without marking itself, in hours only, in the angle of shadows and the rhythm of breath and movement, and for a while it seemed like the morning had folded itself back into something ordinary, as if nothing had happened at all. But out here, nothing ever truly disappears. It settles into the ground, into the air, into the quiet spaces between one moment and the next, waiting not to return, but to remain. Ethan finished his work near the fence line and stood there a moment longer than needed, his gaze drifting again toward the distant cut of the river. It was hard to see from here, just a thin dark line against the pale earth, but it held his attention the way certain things do when they carry more than what they show. He did not move toward it, not yet. He simply stood and let the thought of it exist without pushing it into action, because some places are not meant to be returned to quickly. They ask for time, not distance. The wind shifted, bringing with it a cooler edge that carried faint echoes from beyond the hills, not sound exactly, but the sense of movement somewhere far off, life continuing in directions he would never follow. He turned back toward the cabin and walked slowly, each step grounded not in purpose, but in presence. And as he reached the porch, something caught his eye near the edge of the step, small, easy to miss against the dust and worn wood. He paused, then crouched down, his hand hovering before finally brushing the dirt aside to reveal what lay beneath it, a single turquoise bead, smooth, worn, its color deep even under the thin layer of dust. He did not touch it right away. He simply looked at it, recognizing without needing to question where it had come from or how it had found its way here. It had not been there before, he was certain of that, and yet it rested now as if it had always belonged in that exact place, waiting for him to notice, the same way the morning had waited for him to understand. He picked it up slowly, turning it between his fingers, the surface warm from the sun, the weight almost nothing, and yet it carried something far heavier than that. He closed his hand around it, not gripping, not claiming, just holding, and for a moment he stood there again on the edge of his own space, feeling the line between what had been left behind and what had followed him home. He did not look toward the hills or the river this time. He did not search for any sign of the woman or the riders, because he knew this was not a message that needed direction. It had found him on its own terms. The bead rested in his palm, quiet and steady, like a word that had been spoken without sound. And for the first time since the morning began, he allowed himself a small shift in breath, something deeper, something that reached past the surface of things into the place where meaning settles without needing to be named. He slipped the bead into his pocket, not as a keepsake, not as a token, just as something that now belonged to the same space he occupied. And then he straightened and stepped onto the porch again, the wood creaking softly beneath him, the door still open as he had left it earlier. And as he moved inside, he paused just once at the threshold, not looking back, but feeling the space behind him, the land, the silence, the memory of what had passed through it. And then he stepped forward into the dim interior, the light fading behind him just enough to remind him that some things remain outside, not lost, not gone, simply left where they belong, while what matters most follows a man whether he asks it to or not. Evening came the way it always did out here, not announced, not rushed, just a slow shift in the light that turned the land from gold to something quieter, something that asked less of the eye and more of the memory. Ethan sat on the edge of his porch, one boot resting on the lower step, his hands still, his gaze stretched out across the valley that had returned to its usual shape hours ago, but still carried the weight of what had passed through it. The air cooled, gently pressing against his skin and bringing with it the faint scent of distant water and dry grass settling for the night. He reached into his pocket without thinking, his fingers closing around the single turquoise bead, and he turned it once between them, not studying it, not searching for meaning, just feeling its presence there, the same way a man feels the steady rhythm of his own breath without needing to count it. The horizon darkened slowly, the line between land and sky softening until it almost disappeared, And in that quiet, fading, Ethan found himself remembering not the moment of the necklace breaking, not the circle of riders, not even the words that had been spoken, but the space between those things, the silence where choice had lived before it became action, the kind of silence that does not tell a man what to do, only shows him what he already is when nothing else speaks. He leaned forward, slightly resting his forearms on his knees, the bead still in his hand, and let his eyes drift toward the place where the river cut through the land, now hidden in shadow, but no less present. Because of it, he did not need to see it to know it was there, the same way he did not need to hear the woman's voice again to remember what had been said. Some things once spoken do not repeat themselves. They remain unchanged no matter how far a man walks from them. The first stars appeared one by one, faint at first, then clearer as the sky deepened and the world grew still enough to hold them. Ethan closed his hand around the bead once more, and for a moment there was a thought there, not a question, not a doubt, just a quiet recognition that what he carried now was not something given, not something taken, but something that had chosen its place without asking him if he was ready. And he understood then that this was how certain things stayed, not as burdens, not as rewards, but as truths that lived alongside a man, without needing to be named. The night settled fully around him, the sounds of the land soft and distant, the kind that remind you that you are never truly alone, even when no one stands beside you. He leaned back slightly against the post of the porch, letting the wood take part of his weight, and closed his eyes just long enough to feel the moment pass through him without holding on to it. When he opened them again, the valley was dark, the sky wide and full above him, and the line between what had been and what would come next no longer something he needed to follow or define. He rose slowly, not out of restlessness, not out of purpose, just because the moment had reached its end, and stepped inside the cabin, the door closing behind him with a soft sound that did not echo beyond the walls. The bead remained in his pocket, unseen, unnoticed by anyone but him, and the land outside stretched on as it always had, unchanged to those who would pass through it, and yet holding quietly within it the memory of a morning when no man reached for a weapon, and still something heavier than any fight had been decided without a single word needing to be raised.